am filling in for someone, but you may be reading this thinking, what's this guy talking about? This is a little crazy, building the same CMS 3 times. So in this presentation, I'm going to try and convince you and the people you work for that you should learn how to build this stuff at work, which I think is kind of controversial. We all tend to believe in learning. Obviously, that's why we're here, but I think the office is a unique context. I should also add that this presentation is done by Chelsea, so I'm filling in. She got whisked off to San Jose to present a hackathon project, and they looked to pull from the bench, and I was like, put me in, coach, I got hoop dreams. So that's why I'm here. I'm a little less knowledgeable about Angular, but hopefully this should still be valuable to you. Cool. So to convince you and your bosses that you should do this stuff at the office, we kind of have to answer these two questions. Why should you pay people to learn at work? And why waste time studying your competition if you've already got your framework you're going to use? And this is kind of the reason. When we learn a framework that we like, we get these feelings about it. We're like, you know what framework? I've used a lot of other frameworks in the past, and you're special. Let's make this into a relationship. And this is what psychologists call confirmation bias, and confirmation bias is a lot of what the scientific method is kind of constructed to combat. So it's important to challenge that. And one of the answers, that's kind of the short answer to the question of why build something 3 times. One of the parts of the longer answer is this guy, John Dewey. He was the president of the American Psychological Association in 1899. He's also the architect of a lot of our education system. And John Dewey believed that fundamentally learning is about community. And obviously we believe that here. We're all here in a community to learn. But I think the key insight from him is that the context that you learn in, the most powerful part of it is how you relate the information you're getting to the world. So anything that you're picking up, you're thinking, oh, I'm going to share this with my friends Bob and Steve and Jessica. They're going to be really interested in this thing I learned at the Angular 2 meetup last night. That's one context for you. Another really powerful context is your community at work. And we all sort of implicitly believe this with John Dewey if we believe in open source. Open source is a lot about community. If you are in a shop where you adhere to agile or lean methodologies, you also believe in the power of team learning implicitly. Those are, there's the 2 pizza rule for, teams not getting too big, and that establishes a context where knowledge can flow freely between all of those people there. So one part of this argument is that is a really powerful place to do learning, and any learning that you're picking up anyways in one of these events, you're ferrying to that team in the office. Another part of this explanation is this guy, Georgy Gauss. In the early 1900s, he proved the competitive exclusion principle. So that is a study of perfect competition. And what he did is he put a couple species of bacteria in the same petri dish and saw how they competed. And what he saw was when there's perfect competition, that is, things compete for the same habitat, they compete for the same mates, they compete for the same resources, one will almost always demolish the other. And I like to sum this up as species most closely related to each other tend to compete the fiercest. And we see this regularly in software. So you can see this in the feud between Vim and Emacs. I mean, come on, guys. Like, they're both programmer editors. You see this in Ruby versus Python. And you see this in SQL versus NoSQL. And, as long as the competition isn't exactly perfect, that is, each of them carve out their own niche, they can both thrive and survive. And the competition actually drives them both to better themselves. So it's important to learn from the people you're competing with. You can see this in Vim and Emacs, where V used to have the edge of being fast and agile and light. Emacs had the edge of being extensible, easy to use. They've both sort of kind of converged towards that middle ground, and they've established their own specific domains and how you interface with the editor. The same is true of like NoSQL and SQL. Like Postgres and other relational databases are adding JSON storage as schemas for your columns, and vice versa. You see MongoDB getting more features that guarantee better consistency in the stuff that you're working on. So, with this in mind, we saw an opportunity at eBay. We had a page that needed to be redesigned, and we figured we'd take a day and elect some of our developers to go look at other frameworks that are out there. See what we could learn from those frameworks, see if we're crazy in how we're building things, and see what we could bring back. Worst case scenario, we learn that what we're doing is horrible, and we need to rewrite it all. But that's okay. That means we're kind of challenging that little raccoon with the ring that we saw earlier. And best case scenario, we walk away with some new ideas, but we feel confident about how we're approaching things, and that allows you to develop, without asking what if so much. You kind of get to say, you know what, everybody has these same problems that we're struggling with. We're in the right place. So, who here has been to eBay in the past year or so? Man, there are like 20 hands in the room. It's a great place to sell your old iPhones, by the way, if you're upgrading, just a heads up. But this is what the homepage looks like now. It's probably very different than what you last remember if you visited us in the 90s. What we've done is this page gets about 80 million page views a day, and it can host up to 1 billion different items. So rather than just leave our users to the savages of text-based search, we collect some of those items into collections like this. So some of these collections are very timely. You can see the Emmys are there. Some of them are not, like this car diagram that we see. Basically what happens is every time we have to update these collections, we have a curator who curates these groups of items together, tells a programmer which items they are, programmer assembles it into a component, and then we update the homepage. And it's not too hard. Essentially, we're just updating a template, but our developers started to feel like it was death by 10,000 paper cuts. We have to update these pretty regularly. The Emmys is probably no longer relevant to our audience. So we figured, like good developers, we'd try and automate that. So with this new tool, we decided we needed to build a CMS, and we needed things to be draggable. Now, normally, we build stuff with Markojs, which is our kind of homebrew templating system. If you add Marko widgets on top of Markojs, you get something that's very similar to React and AngularNYC and everything else. So why not just build with that? Well, it's all those things we discussed earlier. We don't know if what we're doing with Markojs is state-of-the-art, or if it's up-to-date, or if it's still good. We don't know how we're doing things differently than everything else out there. So we elected maybe a handful of programmers, 2 or 3 folks. Each of them got to choose a framework that they wanted to investigate. And then we basically built a proof of concept in a day. So we time-boxed it. We had people do self-directed learning, so they were passionate about what they were doing. And then we presented the learning at the end in a normal team meeting kind of setting. So I'm going to walk you through our little experience doing that, what we learned about the various different frameworks we compared to, and hopefully convince you that this is a worthwhile exercise for your businesses to take on as well. Cool. So first one we're going to jump into is React and Redux. This is definitely one of the most popular frameworks in the room. And it's easy to see why. React kind of takes the approach of, old world is MV whatever. It can be slow. It's really easy to shoot yourself in the foot. And in that old world, you want to get rid of that. You want to make it easy to apply updates to your code, and you want to make it easy to reason about what you're updating. So if you hear about React being declarative, being easy to think about, that's all definitely true. We like the modularity. React is very much against mix-ins or other ways to do kind of multiple inheritance like that. They prefer composability, which is very nice. That felt great to work with and was really easy to reason about. Let's see, just checking my notes here. Sorry, it's kind of hard to read off my phone. Oh, whoops. Oh, yeah, and there's a great blog post that kind of details React's approach to kind of handling dependencies and organizing code by Dan Abramoff. There's a link to it in my slides, which I'll link to the meetup group at the end of this talk if you're interested in reading about that. Essentially, like React is very opinionated about how it does things in contrast to a lot of old frameworks. So React says that everything you inherit is immutable from parent classes, and if you want to update your state, there's a particular way to do that. It's unidirectional flow. You don't have to do a lot of checking. Like Vikas mentioned earlier, everything kind of gets handled by the shadow DOM automatically. Things that we also liked about React, pure functions are a part of React and Redux together. So we had never dabbled with this functional programming concept, but essentially what a pure function means state never leaks. You never really handle it inside of your functions. You do it with I guess the functional term is I think a monad. Correct me on that if I'm wrong at the end of this, but essentially it makes it really easy to pass information between your functions and then wire up test cases for that. And finally, JSX is a really neat way to bundle your code together. So if you've done any reading about web components or anything in that vein, JSX is kind of React's stab, whereas Angular 2 kind of takes the approach of HTML first. You embed your JavaScript inside your HTML. React takes the approach of JavaScript first. So all your HTML gets handled by JavaScript, and you pass that JavaScript around in this JSX wrapper to get things done. So JSX is kind of half JavaScript, half XML. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, though. One of the bad sides of the shadow DOM, while it is fast, means we can't use our old favorite tools for updating stuff. So a big part of this project was making pieces draggable to easily resort things. And we couldn't use jQuery to do that. So that was kind of a bummer. Another bummer is that batteries aren't included with React. So React is essentially just the view in the MVC or what I'll call MV whatever kind of framework. And you have to add Redux or some other kind of, I guess what they call a Flux type system to handle the model. And that means there's a lot of fracturing inside the community for how to handle things. It means it's harder to Google for errors you run into. It's harder to pick a React dev up off the street and say, hey, come work with us on this project. It means there's a little more of a learning curve when you're jumping into any new React project. Cool. And let me see if I can share just basically what the code looks like. Cool. So this is just the view component. So you can see there's some boilerplate at the top, as you'd expect. React has concept of collections. That's just, I think that's pretty standard. It's how you collect all your components together. And then at the bottom, this is us implementing the Draggle library. So it's relatively easy to read. You can see the JavaScript interpolation kind of stuff being passed in here. It's nice. It's easy to work with. It's easy to reason about. We liked it. This is just kind of a brief, quick look at all this stuff. Not really a deep dive. Cool. So the next thing we looked at is Backbone. Backbone is OG. It's kind of one of the older frameworks that is, I guess, what you'd consider a previous generation. And we thought that was useful to look at because we have a lot of people who we work with that come from coding boot camps. So they've only ever built stuff in, React or Angular or Ember.js or one of those current kind of to-do MVC frameworks. So the reasoning behind why that stuff is really opinionated didn't really translate to them. So it was nice taking a peek at how the old world kind of worked. Found that great. We thought that Backbone was really lightweight and easy to use. So we have some old APIs at eBay. eBay is old enough to drink now. So that means we have some legacy APIs that still serve SOAP and XML and all that ugly stuff. And Backbone kind of makes an assumption that you're working with RESTful interfaces. So that was complicated for us. Thankfully, the code is light enough and well documented enough that it was really easy for us to extend it. So actually, just a quick look at the docs. If you are building docs for your own code base, all right, well, yeah, that's all right. I guess we're not fans of Backbone.js here. That's fine. Anyways, what I was going to point out is that everything kind of fits on one page for Backbone.js, and it solves what I call the Goldilocks problem. Goldilocks problem is everybody can visit the page and find something that feels just right for them. So whether you're a beginner, an intermediate, or an expert, like exactly what you want is one mouse click away. So they've got API reference. They've got kind of an explanation of what the M, the V, and the C are with nice diagrams. And then they've got some intermediate kind of tutorials for how to work with the code. And on top of all that, they have a nice little annotations section where they annotate all of the source code with comments in line kind of off to the left side of the page, which is really nice. Something we didn't see in any of the other tools that were out there. And it's probably just because Backbone's been around for a while. They've had time to kind of build that stuff up. We also like Backbone because it let us use our old tools, jQuery and that kind of slew of things. So when we needed to implement something that was draggable, we just used jQuery sortable library. And likewise, the fact that Backbone demanded a RESTful API wasn't that great. Like we do have a few services that we have to connect to that serve data as SOAP and XML still, so that would mean a lot more tinkering with us. Backbone's also lightweight. It's less opinionated than a lot of the current frameworks, and that encourages DIY. Means there's a lot less off-the-shelf stuff you can grab to just get things done. That's great. Means it's really easy to build upon and extend, but it also means that we're slowed down. It's not just like a turnkey solution where we plug in and get what we want. And finally, I'd say foot shootiness is what I'll call just the ability to do something dumb and have that code go to production, slow down your page, becomes kind of a burden. So you really have to know what you're doing if you want to build something with Backbone. And that's kind of a big tax when you're working on a team of a lot of people. So hopefully we can take a peek at... No, getting nothing now. All right. What? Wait, it's spinning. I believe in you, computer. well, it's probably not that important, but essentially Backbone looks the cleanest out of all the examples. It's like 6 lines of code to get the draggable stuff working, and just reading it, you're like, wow, okay, this is really easy to read through and kind of get immediately. Cool. And finally, we looked at Angular 2. So Angular 2 had some really nice features to it. The first is it comes bundled with a nice ecosystem of tooling. So it introduced us to System.js and TypeScript. And speaking of TypeScript, holy crap, that's really cool. If you haven't dove in yet, definitely do it. My little sales pitch for TypeScript is if you're writing in a dynamically typed language and you're writing unit tests, we all write unit tests, right? I see a disturbing lack of heads nodding right now. Yes, we're supposed to. That's the correct answer. But if you are writing those unit tests, yeah, you're generally checking for types anyways. So you're saving yourself those test cases by using TypeScript, which is awesome. You're kind of dealing with all that stuff up front. Your tests are cleaner. You write fewer of them. It's nice. We also discovered how Angular 2 deals with dependency injection, which adds more testing goodness. That means you're less reliant on the state of your app at any one time when you're running stuff. It means it's really easy to mock up tests and pass those mocks into the tests when you deal with dependency injection in the Angular 2 way. There's actually a great article on that that I think is by one of the sponsors, oddly enough, tonight. There's a ThoughtRam post by Pascal Precht that I highly recommend checking out if you haven't done a deep dive into dependency injection just yet. So that's also included as a link on these slides, which will be on the meetup group. And finally, Angular 2 has batteries included. We don't have to deal with, figuring out what model we want to pair with our view. Backbone has some of that with it as well. You figure whether you want to use Backbone or Backbone with Marionette, and any of these other libraries, which means the system gets kind of fractured. We felt comfortable being able to Google for solutions to problems with Angular 2 and find them immediately, which is awesome. Hardly anyone reads, books on how to do this stuff anymore. Almost everybody Googles when they run into that error message. So we figure that that's actually like a really understated advantage. Yeah, Stack Exchange, that's right. For our drag and drop, we found Angular 2 Grid, which made things really easy. But, this also wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Angular 2 definitely has the biggest learning curve out of all of these tools we could use. Even just learning about dependency injection, you get introduced to 6 kind of very abstract, hard to reason about topics. So there's definitely a good amount of onboarding that has to happen to get people introduced to it. While we love TypeScript and System.js, getting introduced to both of those, that's an additional cognitive load you're placing on your programmers. And we found that Angular 2 was just actually probably the most verbose code out of all the frameworks we looked at. So just in terms of number of lines that got spat out and then kind of tags that got inserted into the HTML, there's a lot of stuff that gets mixed in there. I'm gonna avoid that. Cool. So, we eventually ended up deciding on Angular 2 because we did like the turnkey nature of it. We thought there was a lot of stuff we could learn from exploring that ecosystem a little bit more. And Angular 2's approach of kind of adding those attributes to HTML elements and having those kind of mark what you need updated, what you're trying to manage, mirrored a lot of what we were already doing with Markojs. So it felt very comfortable to us. Cool. So this is our basic kind of goofy app. Basically, just a simple welcome page asking folks to log in. After they log in, they get greeted with all of the collections. I'm going to call this style of web page Craigslist chic. You know, it'd be nice if you could see the Emmys and everything on the side here, but we're building prototypes in a day. So having actual IDs surface was just fine with us. And you can see on the right-hand side of this page, they're the little grippy hamburger draggy things that allowed us to drag components, kind of resort the ordering of things on the page. And finally, we like the error messages. So there was, you know, when things go well, that's nice. There's another one of these screenshots that I decided not to include that shows like 20 different errors when you submit the form wrong. That's arguably more important, but it looks less nice. So went with the success message here. Cool. So we should talk about whether it was valuable or not. What did we learn? We actually learned a lot. You know, Markojs works on top of a morph DOM. That's a public JavaScript library that we put out there that diffs your live DOM instead of a shadow DOM. So it operates very similar to, in speed terms, and to React in the virtual DOM. But because we're using a live DOM, not a shadow implementation, we're able to update the page with tools like jQuery without having the virtual DOM say like, whoa, 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 you didn't do that the virtual DOM way, we're going to wipe that out. This forced us to think outside of that context, forced us to think inside of you know, the way these other tools work. And we found that for certain types of updates that we aren't challenged with yet, but we may be challenged with in the future, concepts like the shadow DOM are really valuable. And we also found that concepts from Angular, like how you handle dependency injection, how tests are written is really refined. So we're starting to pull that stuff back into our main project. Notes we kind of took for next time, and for you folks, in case you are interested in running this at your own businesses, you need management buy-in to make this work. If you and your teammates tacitly agree to go build something for a day and not do any real work, your manager is going to get pissed off. Don't do that. The ideal experiment is also something that's discrete and separate from your main app. So it's something new, not replacing an existing component. And don't expect to rewrite everything in your new framework of choice after the experiment's over. You've still got all of that legacy code to manage and handle. There's usually a big advantage to sticking with the devil you know. That all said, it's definitely worthwhile to dive in. And if you choose to do this, don't try and compare all 20 frameworks on todomvc.com. Pick one or two that you think will be useful. Pick ones that are popular. Those are tools that, you know, essentially have probably differentiated themselves enough that the competitive exclusion principle says there's something useful to learn from them. And yeah, reduce the amount of, it also reduces the amount of cognitive load you're putting on people in terms of new things they have to learn in this kind of quick session to get a download on all these other frameworks. Cool, and that's essentially it. That's my presentation. I encourage all of you to run your own experiments, convince your bosses to let you learn at work. We found it really valuable. Gave us, everybody in the office, a new shared language for discussing how to advance our own app. And yeah, we're looking forward to doing it again, like 6 months or so. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, yes, we built a wrapper just to kind of shim that in. We realized that that's something that's needs to be updated. Like that's kind of another valuable learning is we shouldn't be forced to work with these old sorts of tools. So that's a project that we're working on. It's either wrapping everything in a nice digestible kind of format, or just like upgrading all of those servers to new easily digestible API. So we have another talk that some of our engineers have given that kind of details us moving from a Java-only infrastructure to a Node.js infrastructure, which allows our front-end people to kind of keep that stuff up to date. You talk to a Java engineer who's been maintaining the same thing for 10 years, and you're like, hey, what if we change this? Their answer is almost always no. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I'd have to ask Diraj, who chose Angular 2 as the project he wanted to learn on. Big part of this is the power of implicit learning. So the social context of being in a community or being in a team is one important component of learning. The other one is your internal drive to get something done. So just letting Diraj kind of select what he thought was most interesting is what led us to Angular 2. I would assume that a big part of it is just seeing what the latest and greatest out there is. So it gives us a taste of kind of the bleeding edge. I believe it's us hitting an actual service that's in QA and having everything kind of generate from that. Yeah. Sorry, say again? Is that like Haml or? Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. I believe that that's how we use a system called Lasso, and Marko widgets is also very declarative. So you bundle your CSS in line with your other code, like screw the separation of concerns. As long as the component stays small, we find that works pretty well. Once it gets a little bit bigger, that gets kind of gnarly. It's a good question. Does anyone know if you can implement modular CSS in Angular 2? Any hands? No? Stack Overflow, yeah. Cool. Webpack magic.
Let's do one more question for the person who gave us leftover NPM, and then let's wrap up.
So, I was just curious: is the eBay website right now going to go move to Angular, or just you using this tool thing to update the actual website?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are still doing everything in Markojs because we've got a big legacy with that. But this experiment let us build that kind of tool for non-techie people to interface and update the page on their own. So that, at least for the short term, is definitely an Angular 2.
So it's essentially just spitting out the HTML down to the whole Markojs.
Yeah, exactly. We didn't do any real speed tests. Like I said earlier, we serve 80 million hits a day, and we feel pretty comfortable with Marko in that realm. It would have taken probably a couple days to do real benchmarks of Angular, and honestly, we're lazy programmers. We don't want to rewrite our whole code base. Cool. Thanks, guys.